Hello, everybody. This is Chad Parker. Thank you for coming to this session, Child Abuse, the Church's Response and Responsibility. I am grateful to be able to have the opportunity to share this moment and this time with you. First, I want to give some honor and appreciation to the leadership of the United Pentecostal Church International for allowing us to have this session, obviously much needed session, and also Tupelo Children's Mansion and the Center for Apostolic Counseling, both playing their part in helping compile this information and making this presentation possible. A little bit about myself. For those of you who do not know me, I currently serve as the Executive Vice President of Tupelo Children's Mansion in Tupelo, Mississippi. Angela, my wife, and I have been married about 22 years. We have 5 children, 3 grandchildren, and I have a bachelor's degree in social work, master's of science of social work, and currently working on my doctorate of social work through the University of Alabama. I'm an ordained minister of the United Pentecostal Church, and I hold a licensed master social worker for Mississippi and the state of Texas. I'm also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Texas. I hold a board certification for telemental health as a telemental health provider, and I'm also a darkness to light facilitator. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we progress through this presentation. So I do want to take a moment to just maybe warn you that obviously the content of what we're going to discuss, especially as it involves child abuse, can sometimes be triggering, can be very difficult to hear. So you may feel uncomfortable. You may find yourself feeling maybe offended through this presentation. And if you've experienced abuse in some way, again, it may trigger you. And so I do suggest that if you have a difficult time processing some of the things that you hear during this session, that you would seek out professional counseling to continue working through what you've heard. This is a very sensitive subject, and I recognize that, but it's also a much needed subject for us to address in order to protect our children and our churches. So first, let's define what is child sexual abuse. This definition, I believe, really encompasses everything that we need to look at. Child sexual abuse involves any sexual activity with a child where consent is not or cannot be given. This includes sexual contact that is accompanied by force or threat of force, regardless of the age of the participants, and all sexual contact between an adult and a child, regardless of whether there is deception or the child understands the sexual nature of the activity. Sexual contact between an older and a younger child also can be abusive if there's a significant disparity in age, development, or size, rendering the younger child incapable of giving informed consent. So you're seeing a very broad definition there. And it's important to point out as far as the legal definition of child sexual abuse, especially as it involves an adult, which would be somebody 18 or older, and then a child, virtually the child is considered unable to give consent. So any type of sexual contact between that adult and that child, even if it is considered quote unquote consensual, is still considered child sexual abuse. So examples of abusive touching behaviors would include fondling of a child's genitals, buttocks, or breasts, penetration of the child's mouth, anus, or vagina by the abuser or with an object, and coercing a child to fondle him or herself, the abuser, or another child. So these are typical touching type behaviors, and frankly, it's often what most people think about when they hear the term child sexual abuse. So it's important to recognize that there's also a whole nother category of abusive non-touching behaviors, and we want to cover those during this seminar. And those would include exposing oneself to a child, viewing and violating the private behaviors of a child or a teen while undressing or bathing, taking sexually explicit or provocative photographs of a child, showing pornography or sexually suggestive images to a child, or talking in sexually explicit or suggestive ways to children in person or by phone. And then let's pay attention specifically to this very last one, sending sexually explicit or suggestive messages to children by internet or text messages. So again, these are non-touching behaviors that are legally considered child sexual abuse. So engaging in inappropriate text messaging between an adult and a child, and this is something that we see sometimes whenever you may have an adult that's 19 or 20 years old sending very inappropriate messages that may or may not include pictures, but just in text to someone who may be 15 or 16. And even though it is a consenting type of relationship, that is still considered child sexual abuse. So these non-touching behaviors, it's important to recognize that those are just as legally wrong as the touching behaviors. And obviously, we want to make sure that we are cognizant of all of those types of behaviors when we are looking at child sexual abuse. So approximately 1 in 10 children will be a victim of sexual abuse before their 18th birthday. That is such a staggering statistic. It's heartbreaking, and unfortunately, especially in my line of work, I would be able to confirm that that is absolutely true. There's so much sexual abuse that is happening. And we're going to talk through some facts and some statistics here for the next little bit. And it's probably going to leave you feeling like you just want to gather your children and never let them out of the house, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But we don't want to live in fear. And that's really the whole purpose of this seminar, is to bring awareness, because awareness can perpetrate prevention. And we want to be able to create really a community of prevention within the United Pentecostal Church. And so let's kind of dive into some of these things that I'm talking about. First, I think it's important to recognize the fact that sexual abuse can take place anywhere, even within the walls of the church. There's literally no place that sexual abuse, or abuse for that matter, cannot happen. It's also a fact that most church leaders feel very inadequate when it comes to addressing sexual abuse. Maybe they don't feel like that they have the background or the training or the knowledge, or maybe that they've been raised in a setting where discussing sex is just very taboo, very uncomfortable, and so they haven't figured out a way to address this within the church setting. So when it comes to dealing with actual cases of sexual abuse, then those feelings of inadequacy really are exacerbated at that point. And a lot of times, unfortunately, what we see is our church leaders making wrong decisions and doing things maybe not exactly the way that they should, not because they're trying to cover things up, but really it's just a lack of training and a lack of knowledge on what is the most appropriate way to deal with such a very sensitive topic, especially if it involves church families. Statistically speaking, an individual is more likely to be abused by someone in the church than the congregation is to be involved in a church shooting. So a lot of times, we make these preparations within our churches, and we've seen this happen through the history. I was the administrative pastor during the time that some church shootings were taking place, and we acted very quickly to put together a security team within our property and making sure that our church services were adequately covered and secure in every aspect of our campus. But what's the fact is it's more likely that a child is going to be sexually abused by someone in the church than it is that church is ever going to experience that shooting. So the question would be, are we taking the necessary steps to make our churches a preventative community, to make sure that everybody's well educated and that this is something that we're taking seriously? Abuse towards children, even sexual abuse, is most often perpetrated by a trusted individual. It's very rare that a stranger is involved in child sexual abuse. Most of the time, that child is abused by somebody not only that they know, but the family knows, and there's a mutual trust there, a mutual trusting relationship. And so that's what makes the whole concept of the sexual abuse even more devastating for those that have to be involved. So it's important that we realize churches are vulnerable. Studies have shown that faith communities are more vulnerable to abuse than secular communities. 93% of offenders describe themselves as being religious. These offenders have more victims, and they have younger victims, and have only a 3% chance of getting caught. And the reality is this is because most often in our church environments, we tend to kind of lean toward the idea that it is already a safe environment, that we can trust everybody that's there. They have been baptized in Jesus' name. They are full of the Holy Ghost. And so surely nothing terrible is going to happen in this environment. But what we see, again, statistically speaking, is that that isn't always the case. And so our churches are vulnerable because we don't see this necessarily as a weak spot within our structure of the church. Current church offender statistics, and again, this is probably going to be some things that may be concerning to you, but there is an end to this that I think will be hopeful. But data analyzed from 326 church abuse reports occurring between 1982 and 2014, and again, these were specific sexual abuse reports that were taken directly from the fact that the offender and the relationship with the victim was solely wrapped up within their church relationship. So most often the offenders are typically male. The offender ages ranged between 18 and 88. So we're talking a broad range here, that just because they're older doesn't make them more likely to be safe, or just because they are an older teen doesn't make them, or a young adult doesn't make them more likely to be an offender. You can't judge it based on age. And the offender roles in these 326 cases, 34.9% of these cases, the pastor was the offender. 31.4% of these cases, the youth pastor was the offender. 8.3% was a youth volunteer. 5.4 was the associate pastor. 4.8 was the music minister. 3.2 was a ministry volunteer of some kind. And then all other offenders were labeled at 3% or less. So there were 5 specific locations in which these sexual abuse cases took place. They were at the church, at the offender's home, an off-site meeting place, an off-site church activity, and at the victim's home. So basically, when you break that down, you recognize out of those 5 sites, there's really not that many other places. So again, we kind of go back to the whole concept that sexual abuse can happen anywhere, and specifically the reason why we are more prone and can be more victimized in our church setting is because there's more trust in what's happening, and we just make the assumption that all of the bases are covered when it comes to the safety of our children. I do want to note that those statistics do prove that offenders are typically male. We do also recognize that those numbers are very skewed due to the fact that adult female offenders are very rarely reported by the victims. And this is also especially true if the victim is a teen male, because obviously in a situation like that, the teen male doesn't view himself as a victim necessarily if he's having a relationship with an adult female. But those things do happen, and they do happen more often than what we realize or even recognize, because again, a lot of the times that type of abuse is not reported. So a few things I want to leave with you in regards to just overall statistics. First of all, abuse is obviously more than sexual. According to the 2020 statistics, neglect was the most reported type of child maltreatment, with sexual abuse ranking 3rd. So there you see the statistical analysis of all of the different types of child maltreatment and how those were reported in 2020. It's also important to recognize, and we have brought this up already, that abuse can happen anywhere. So whether it's home, church, school, work, recreational activities, home, a family, or friends, literally abuse can happen anywhere. It's not isolated to just 1 or 2 places, and it's not isolated to just sexual abuse. There are different types of abuse, and as churches, we have to be able to recognize what these look like. If you are working in youth ministry, you are working in a Sunday school department, you are working with new converts, it is vital that you recognize what are the signs of abuse and when should you engage, and what should you do should you uncover some type of abuse that is happening. So what do you do if you suspect child abuse? You've witnessed child abuse firsthand, you've seen it. Now what do? What is your next step? Or you may have firsthand knowledge of child abuse, but you didn't see it for yourself. You know that child abuse is happening. There's no doubt, but you don't actually see it happening. So what should you do in those situations? Or a situation that could hit home, I guess, a little more would be you found inappropriate pictures and text between a member of your church's youth team and your teenager. So what is your next step? What do? A lot of these, and unfortunately, these are situations that we've actually dealt with. These are not scenarios I made up specifically for this presentation, but the reality is that these are actual things that have happened and questions that have been presented as to, okay, this is where I'm at. What do I do now? Then what do you do when a child trusts you? You are that youth leader, you are that youth volunteer, you are that Sunday school teacher, you have developed a relationship with that teenager or that child, and they have really grown and connected with you, they trust you, and then they come to you and they tell you that they're being abused in some way. What do you do? How do you handle that allegation of abuse? Does your church have a child abuse policy? Is there a child safety policy? Is there a prevention policy of any kind in regards to the structure of your church, your program, your youth, your Sunday school? What is your church's policy on how to handle these? And if there's not a policy, then what is your ultimate responsibility as that youth leader, as that pastor, that associate pastor, the music minister, whatever role that you play in the church? What responsibility do you have when a child trusts you and they come to you? So I want to point out this idea of the mandated reporter, and some of you watching this may be very familiar with what that looks like. A mandated reporter is one who is required by law to report reasonable suspicions of child abuse. Now, before we go any further, I just want to take a moment and read that one single sentence again. A mandated reporter is one who is required by law to report reasonable suspicions of abuse. Not required by law to report confirmed allegations of abuse, confirmed suspicions of abuse, but just reasonable suspicions of abuse. All states designate certain professionals as mandated reporters. Some states require all citizens to report. So you may be a member of a church, but you may also be a certified teacher. You may be a member of a church, but you may also be a registered nurse. You may be a member of a church, but you also may be a therapist or a social worker. Your state laws will have specific mandates for you as an individual and in your professional role, regardless of what role you may play. You may say, well, I'm at the church and I'm a Sunday school teacher, so I'm not really a registered nurse at that time. It doesn't matter. If your state requires you as a nurse to be a mandated reporter, it doesn't matter whether you're playing that role at that moment that you come across these abuse allegations. You are required by law to make those reports. And again, there are some states that require all citizens, regardless of what profession that you may have. If you live in that state, you are a mandated reporter. Some state laws specifically mention clergy as mandated reporters, while others explicitly deny any privilege to which clergy may typically feel entitled when child abuse is involved. And by that, what I mean is a lot of times ministers feel like, well, I don't have to report this because this is something I learned in a pastoral counseling session as their pastor. There's an expectation of confidentiality here. I can't report that. And in some states that may be true, but most states either mention that clergy are mandated reporters, which supersedes that confidentiality. Also, they may specifically imply or specifically say in the law that there is no privilege. So just because you're the pastor doesn't grant you the privilege of not reporting. There is no privilege of confidentiality there. You are required to report child abuse. So as a church staff member, a Sunday school teacher, a youth worker, a volunteer, the pastor, whatever your responsibility is, Your role is at the church. You are personally responsible for knowing your state's reporting laws, because ignorance is not a viable legal defense. You can't say, I didn't know, I wasn't sure, because if it comes back to you, you are expected to know those things. I can provide you with your specific state's current laws if that's something that would be helpful to you, and we'll get to my email and contact information in the presentation. I do have access to most all of the state's requirements, and would be happy to share that with you if that would be helpful. It is important to know that you do not need to have proof of abuse to make a good faith report. You're not reporting abuse that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt is happening because you've seen it, you've witnessed it, and you absolutely know that it's happening. As a mandated reporter, it is your responsibility to report abuse that you may have a reasonable suspicion of, either based on what you've seen and what you've heard, what you've been told by that child. Even if you are uncertain yourself, it is not your responsibility to do the investigation. It is your responsibility to report it to the authorities for them to do the investigation. And even if it's false, it cannot and will not come back on you, because all states have a clause that specifically state that if you're making a good faith report, there's nothing that can come back to you. Most of those reports are done in confidentiality, and so the person or the family that are involved, they'll never even know who made that report. But if something happens to the child and it comes back that they had said something to you, or that you knew that there was something going on and you didn't report, then you are in a much bigger legal problem. Because failure to report is also addressed in most of the state's requirements. Almost every state and territory in the United States imposes penalties on mandated reporters who fail to report child abuse or neglect. And in some states, failure to report is considered a felony. And almost all states have some type of a fine attached to it. And I think the minimum one that I saw was $1,000. Those, such as an employer who engage in any type of action or that appears to prevent or prohibit the reporting of child abuse, they're also subject to penalties. So in cases where you feel like that, you could not report because there were extenuating circumstances in regards to the role that you play, and you have to be able to prove that somebody was literally standing in your way and preventing you from making those reports, you're still going to be held responsible, but also that person who hindered that report. So failure to report is taken very seriously. It is a big deal in all of our states and territories. Again, you need to know your state's laws and where you stand. Ignorance is not a viable legal defense. So here are some strategies that you can use to kind of implement things and help get your church on the right path. First, you can create and implement a child safety policy for your church. If you don't have one, I would be more than happy to work with you to develop a child safety policy. Sometimes these can be very extensive. Sometimes they're very simple, but it kind of has to work into your overall church operations. Most of the time now, your church liability insurance is almost requiring that these be done, and they're providing pretty clear-cut samples for you to just copy and paste, and those are sufficient. But what you have to be careful of is if you are adopting these policies as your child safety policy for your church, you have to make sure that you're actually educating your staff and everybody knows what that child safety policy is, because once you adopt that, that becomes what the law of the land in regards to investigations. If your church has to go under some type of investigation or abuse happen, they're going to ask you what your policy is, and they're going to investigate according to that policy. Did you follow your own policy? Because if not, then that's a whole nother level of just neglect. You can provide and participate in an evidence-informed prevention training. I mentioned that I am a Darkness to Light facilitator. They have a program called Stewards of Children. It is specifically in regards to training people who work with youth how to identify and or prevent child abuse within their setting. That is something a training that I can offer to you, I would be happy to come to your church to provide that training. Also, we can have that training online. So if travel is an issue, that is something that we can set up via Zoom, and we can train your entire staff through this. Most of the time, if you provide the certifications to your insurance company, you can also get a discount because, again, you've provided a prevention strategy for your church. I would also encourage you, if none of that sounds like an option, you can go to Darkness to Light's website and check them out. Somebody in your church can become certified and provide that training in person. It's a super simple process and very informative, and I would highly recommend that being a part of just your annual trainings. Of course, you want to require background checks on all of your volunteer staff. That is really a no-brainer in this day and time. If you don't have a process in place to provide these background checks, I would encourage you to look into something like Planning Center. Many of our churches already use that for the services aspect of it and coordinating their services. But they also have a segment called Checker, in which you can utilize their program. They will do the background check for you and send you via email clearance on your staff. So there are easy ways to do background checks, and you can Google those or check with your local law enforcement to provide some type of or create some type of avenue for you to do background checks on your volunteer staff. This would be vitally important and should be absolutely required that anybody who works with your children or youth ministries must pass a background check. Something that a lot of churches don't think about is hosting a Blue Sunday during Child Abuse Prevention Month, which is the month of April. Designate a Sunday in which this is just what you do. Maybe honor your child abuse workers during that time, your child protection workers. Do something special, educational on that Sunday, and just utilize that Sunday to do some training and discuss the realities of child abuse and how to prevent those and be a true lighthouse for your community when it comes to child abuse. Number 5, incorporate premises monitors or a security team. Again, many churches are doing this in regards to church shootings, but this is very important as well, just to keep things monitored. Having just somebody that their main assignment is to be in the church foyer, to be in the church hallways, to be standing near the bathrooms and watching what is happening with people who know that they're being watched tend to engage less any type of behaviors when it comes to child abuse or child sexual abuse. So just having those extra eyes there decreases the chance that something would happen on your church property. All doors should remain open and or have glass. There should always be a clear line of sight in all of your rooms. So your Sunday school rooms, your youth rooms, whatever it is, any place that children are gathering or children have access to, if those doors are going to be closed, then they need to have glass so that anybody walking by can look into those rooms and see what's going on. It's never a good idea that your rooms just have solid doors that can be shut and nobody can see what's happening. Again, it's just good safety practices. Always think clear line of sight. When walking down a hallway, you should always be able to see into your classrooms and your youth rooms. Use a check-in and check-out system for your children's and youth ministries. This is also something that you could do through Planning Center, and there are other options. But the check-in, check-out system, basically your child checks in, they get a badge, and they're assigned a number, and they don't leave the premises without a staff member or somebody that has a matching badge with that number. And it keeps the children in one place, keeps them accountable to that group, also helps the adults feel safe to know where their children are. Establish a restroom policy that is clearly communicated to all volunteer staff. Obviously, if you're dealing in children's or youth ministries, sometimes children have to use the restroom during the process of whatever your program may be. Many times, especially in children's ministry, we accompany those kids to the restroom. Just having simple rules like there's never less than 2 staff members in the bathroom at a time You never take one child by yourself. Just very simple, common sense approaches to that. It needs to be written in policy and enforced. And making sure that also, again, if you're having a premise monitor or a security team, they clearly understand those restroom policies so they can remind people if they see a staff member taking a child to the bathroom, hey, we don't do that. You need to find another adult to go in there with you. Just as building in some accountability within your church structure. Provide continuing education to your staff and volunteers. I would say that annual training would be the absolute minimal. You need to be discussing child safety and your child abuse policies within your church at least once a year. And a lot of that's really going to depend on your church culture and how often you rotate through volunteers so that you're making sure every new person that's coming through is receiving that training in an adequate amount of time. You don't want it to be a new person goes into a classroom to teach in your children's ministry and they're not getting the training for another 8 months. So figure out a way to, again, fit this within your church culture and your structure and making sure that you have adequate trainings that people are catching this as frequently as they need to. And then it's continuing education. Best practices change as research looks into what's happening and current trends. And so it's always good to be able to engage in, again, an evidence-informed, evidence-based prevention training. And then finally, number 10, and probably the most important, educate everybody. Everyone plays a role in prevention. And so this is not just, well, I'm only going to train those that are working with children and youth, but you want to just train everybody. Find a way to engage everyone in your prevention strategies. The roles that they play within the prevention strategies may look different, and the way that they implement the accountability process within your church may look different, but everybody should be educated because you want your church to be the safest place for a child. A parent can bring their child and know beyond a shadow of a doubt, my kid is safe here. So those are some strategies that you can implement. Again, I would be happy to help you in any way that I can. A couple of resources I'm going to leave for you: the Center for Apostolic Counseling. This is an incredible resource. It is a network of licensed mental health professionals, from psychologists to clinical social workers, licensed professional counselors, licensed marriage and family therapists. They're all apostolic, all engaged in ministry and in their local churches. They've come together under this one umbrella to make their resources and availability to you a little bit simpler. So visit apostoliccounseling.org, or you can call the 800 number if you need assistance, if you've been a victim of abuse, if you know your child has been a victim of abuse and you need somebody that understands not only where they're coming from and the trauma that they've experienced, but also the spiritual aspect of it. The Center for Apostolic Counseling is an incredible resource. We have some magnificent therapists available to you. And then the Darkness to Light program, again, that's www.d2l.org. Anybody can go to their website. A ton of resources available to you, many of them free. And if you would like to participate in the training, all of that information is there and available for you. I would recommend it. Again, I would be happy to work with you to do a training at your church, either live or via Zoom. But you can get certified and you can be that person for your church. The idea behind Darkness to Light is that we are building a community of prevention, and I can think of nothing better to do with the United Pentecostal Church is that we just build a community of prevention for our children. So here's my contact information. It's easiest and best to reach me via email, chadparker@mansionkids.org. That way I have the opportunity to get back to you as I can. If you need to call, if there's an urgent situation, you can call the TCM offices or you can call my office line directly. Either of those are viable options. But again, the best way to reach me is always going to be via email. So if you can write that down, I'll leave it up for just a moment for your consideration. Again, if there's anything that I can do to help you in formulating a policy for your church or tossing around some ideas for what you could do, because again, everybody's church structure looks a little bit different. So your strategy needs to fit your culture. Or if there's specific situations that you would like to talk through, I am available and here to help as much as I can. We want the body to be healthy, and that's kind of where I see my role in all this, is just helping the body to be as healthy as we can be. So with that, here are some of the references that I've utilized in this presentation. Thank you so much for coming and being a part of this and watching. I hope it was a blessing to you. And again, if you have any questions, I hope to hear from you. God bless.